Okay, hello everybody. Today we will be talking about Chapter 8, Transport in Humans. So over here, I'll first be discussing what is the need for a transport system, and then we'll be going through what are the structure and composition of blood, and not only understanding what blood contains, but what are the blood groups and what's the function of blood, and how it is being transported in your human body by the circulatory system. And in the mammals, we usually have a double circulatory system as compared to other living organisms. And what are some of the disease related to the circulatory system? So over here, you will understand why it is important to have a transport system as for a multicellular organism. When we mean multicellular organism over here, what we actually refer to is basically organisms that are made up of many cells. As compared to unicellular organisms that are mainly made of just one cell, and they will just be dependent on passive transport like diffusion and osmosis for your nutrients. So as the more complex you get, definitely you will need more complex transport systems, more complex circulatory system. So for unicellular organisms, they do not need a transport system for the exchange of or distribution of materials. Now, when it's actually made up of a unicellular organisms, especially if your exchange of materials occurs easily, right, by passive transport like diffusion or osmosis, then you are highly dependent on the surface area to volume ratio. Now, diffusion is an example of a passive transport which doesn't require energy. Now, in a way to support a unicellular organism, this can still be sufficient. However, when you have a more complex internal structure, as you are a more like a multicellular organism, you will need other systems in place to help to transport nutrients from one end of the cell or the body to another end. So in this case, there is a greater need for a transport system in order to transport materials within a multicellular organism as compared to a unicellular organism. So in multicellular organism, diffusion is definitely inadequate for transport, as diffusion is a passive transport. You don't rely, there isn't a need for, there isn't a use of energy, so you're highly dependent on the concentration of the environment with respect to the cell. Secondly, the multicellular organism, you have actually a higher volume as compared to the surface area. So in that aspect, it's very hard to determine diffusion will works better with in a higher surface area to volume ratio. So a larger body will have a reduction in the surface area to volume ratio. This means that surface area is low while volume is high. So these together will give you a reduced surface area to volume ratio. And the cells are generally in a multicellular organisms, they are deeper in the body and further away from the external environment, like the skin. Therefore, a transport system is required in larger organisms. Now let's talk about the structure and composition of blood. Now, blood is actually, it contains many different components. We have your white blood cell, your red blood cell, your plasma, your platelets, and together we call it blood. Okay, so in this particular area, you'll be learning what are the various components and its function, and what is its special adaptation in order for it to carry out its function. So blood is a tissue, it's a fluid tissue, and it's mainly made up of a few of these: plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Do note that other books may call red blood cells white blood cells in other names. Okay, and white blood cells, right, there are actually two types of white blood cells that you'll be studying. One is the lymphocytes, the other is the phagocytes. And in a nutshell, in the blood, right, if you were to centrifuge it, what's a centrifuge? Centrifuge means spinning your blood such that it is able to be able to settle based on the density of the components. So it is arranged according to density of the plasma, red blood cell, white blood cell, and platelets. And through this arrangement, you should be able to tell which has the lowest density and which has the highest density. So if you remember your lower secondary school syllabus, lower density means you tend to be able to float, whereas higher density you are more or less able to be found at the bottom part of the solution or you are sinking. So red blood cell has the highest density. And then plasma has the lowest density. Okay. Then as and when followed by a white blood cell. Along here, you can also see that plasma takes up 55% of blood, whereas your other components like platelets, white blood cell, and red blood cell, they are the 45%. Now, plasma is mainly made of water, and being made of water, you could see that it's able to transport nutrients very fast. Okay, about 90% in which in plasma, 90% of it is actually water, and there's actually transport. They are actually dissolved substances. So what are some of these proteins? They are your fibrinogen and prothrombin. These are important for blood clotting, which we'll be discussing later in the chapter, and that they contain antibodies, which actually helps to fight off your bacteria with the help of your white blood cells. There is also mineral salts such as your chlorides, your sulfates of calcium and sodium. So these are the ones that helps to nourish the cells around you. It transport food substances and definitely it will carry food substances such as glucose, amino acids, and fats. Now, they do not, in your blood, there is no form of digestion. Digestion occurs in the alimentary canal, and once the large food has been actually digested by your enzymes, it will become soluble and therefore absorbed by your small intestine, carried to carried to the different blood capillaries. So if you remember in your nutrition in humans chapter, your amino acids and fats are your amino acids and glucose are transported by your blood capillaries, whereas your lactate will transport your fats. Then of course you have your waste products such as your urea, uric acid, and creatine. All these are actually uh, formed from your liver after it has undergone deamination of the amino acid, and of course your hormones. So these are the things including water that makes up plasma. Next, like over here is the other name for red blood cells, but in O-level examination and also N-level, writing red blood cells is sufficient. Just be aware that if the question asks for erythrocytes, they meant red blood cell. And this constitutes 99% in the blood. So if you remember previously, plasma is 55% and it's mainly solution. The other 45% is blood, which contains a cell, like a white blood cell, red blood cell, and your platelets. So in this case, out of that 45%, 99% is your red blood cells, and they are mainly produced in your bone marrow. What's a bone marrow? It is the component that is found inside the bone. So this is the thing, the one in red. Okay, and they after the red blood cell has undergone wear and tear and its function, or maybe after 120 days, it will then be destroyed in the spleen, where it will subsequently be reused again to make newer red blood cell. So what is the main function of the red blood cell? This requires you to revisit the video on the chapters of cells, whereby it actually discuss what is its adaptation. So purpose or function of red blood cells is to actually transport oxygen to cells in the body. Now, why is oxygen required? Oxygen is required to supply your cell for supply your cell in order for it to undergo aerobic respiration. And through aerobic respiration in the mitochondria, it will then be able to release energy for your cellular activity. So how is then the red blood cell adapted for its function? These are revision from the chapter 2 of cells. So first of all, your red blood cell is filled with a red pigment called hemoglobin, and this hemoglobin is a component found in red blood cells that will be able to bind with oxygen. So what happens is hemoglobin when bind with oxygen, you actually form the component called oxyhemoglobin. Okay, and this allows the red blood cell to actually carry it around. And what's more is that due to the absence of the nucleus, it allow the red blood cell to take more hemoglobin, and having more hemoglobin means you can combine with more oxygen atoms or molecules and therefore transport oxygen around your body. Another thing is that the red blood cell has a circular biconcave shape. Now, do take note when we say bi, it means both sides of the red blood cell has a concave shape and not just one side. Okay, and what this does is it helps to increase the surface area to volume ratio for faster uptake of oxygen, or you can say more efficient uptake of oxygen. Not only that, this is something new that was not indicated in the first chapter, in the second chapter of cells, is that red blood cells are elastic. Now, being elastic allows the cells to actually be able to squeeze through your tiny blood capillaries in which they are so narrow to the point where only maybe in one blood capillary, okay, it's a blood capillary, the cell would be actually, the red blood cell would have to be by alone, like a line, in order for it to actually to exchange of the nutrients or even the oxygen. And on top of that, right, this is one unique way whereby you can help to slow down the blood flow. Now, why is this possible? Being able to slow down the blood flow allows the red blood cells to have even more time to release oxygen. So there must be a fair balance. The second composition of blood is that it has the white blood cells or leukocytes. So these cells are generally larger in size than your red blood cells. However, they are fewer in number as compared to the number of red blood cells. Now, why is this so? If you have too much white blood cells than red blood cells, your white blood cells they may target your own tissue, your own organs as enemies, and therefore you start to self-destruct. You start to destroy your own cells that are generally healthy. So you must have a fair balance for it. So leukemia is the condition whereby you have a more white blood cell count as compared to red blood cell. And then the only way to more or less treat this is to have a bone marrow transplant. And being able to find a suitable donor for your bone marrow transplant is not very easy. Your white blood cells are also produced in the bone marrow, and that's why you can see your bone marrow is so important that it produces white blood cells, it produces red blood cells as well. So always do take care of your bone marrow, and generally they are also destroyed at the spleen. So one unique thing about your red blood cell is due to the absence of the nucleus, it doesn't actually be able to repair itself. Therefore, that's why it has actually a very short lifespan. However, for the white blood cell, they do have also a limited lifespan of a few days, even though they have a nucleus. Okay, so this is one thing to take note of. If let's say you have the misconception that a nucleus is always required for extended lifespan. Next is it is colorless as they do not have hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is generally red in color. When combined with oxygen, it will be like more or less reddish pink. However, when without the combination of oxygen, hemoglobin will give you a purplish blue. That's why sometimes when you carry heavy load, the plastic bag will sort of stop blood circulation or use a rubber band. And what will happen is that your hand will start to be blue in color due to the deprive of oxygen. Okay, it is mobile, meaning it is able to move around in order to change their shape and squeeze through walls of these tiny blood capillaries to actually attack the bacteria. Okay, and they are irregular in shape and also contain nucleus. So there are two main types of white blood cells. We have your lymphocytes, and then the second we have your phagocytes. So your lymphocytes, right, they generally have a round large nucleus as compared to phagocytes which has nucleus. Now log means like it's like a Mickey Mouse shape, where it's not very follow the shape of a circular nucleus. Okay, so next thing you have actually your small amount of non-granular cytoplasm, in which for phagocytes you have a granular cytoplasm. What is granular? You would see that you have all these dot component in your cytoplasm. So these are generally what we meant by granular as compared to the lymphocyte cytoplasm that is generally clear. And on top of that, for lymphocytes, they tend to produce antibodies to fight against the microorganism, while your phagocytes, the meaning of phago means to ingest. They tend to ingest means eat up your foreign particles. So this is one example. So think of it this way, whereby your phagocytes, they are like your kamikaze fighters, where they will go to the bacteria and they will wrap themselves up around the bacteria and ingest it into themselves, and eventually they destroy it together with themselves, so they naturally will die. However, for lymphocyte, they are the ones with the rifle. They will shoot antibodies to kill your microorganisms. So these are the two white blood cells that are in your body. There are definitely a lot more, but in O level, you just have to focus on these two. There are some questions where they actually ask you to describe how the phagocyte actually fight off microorganisms. So what you have to do is using the keyword ingest. So it ingests the foreign particles, or you can say it engulfs the foreign particles and ingest it to kill off the microorganism. Next, blood platelets or thrombocytes, they are actually not true cells. What do we mean by not true cells? That means, right, they do not contain mainly your protoplasms. And what they are is they are just fragments of cytoplasm which are membrane bound. So what you can see is even though it just contains cytoplasm, right, it is still able to function, but it doesn't give a full true cells that has all the parts of the organelles of the cell. Okay, second thing is what is the main purpose of your blood platelets? They are generally used for blood clotting, which we will be discussing more in a subsequent section. Okay, so just to recap, we have actually went through the why do we need the transport system and what are the structure and composition of blood. The need for a transport system is because we are multicellular organisms, and multicellular organisms, we cannot really depend on diffusion. And being a multicellular organism, we have a smaller surface area to volume ratio, as our volumes is actually quite large, and that is why it's not very efficient to rely just on diffusion. Secondly is the cell from one end of the organism to another end is actually very deep and complex, not near the surface of maybe the skin of exposure, and therefore you would definitely need a transport system to channel relevant nutrients to the respective parts of the cell. Next, the structure and composition of blood. We actually talk about what are the components of blood. We explore what is the features of the adaptation of the red blood cell and how it's able to carry out its function of transporting oxygen. We talk about the white blood cells, where there's two main types: the lymphocytes that produces antibodies to fight off microorganisms, while phagocytes, they generally ingest your microorganisms to remove them. Secondly, we talk about the platelets, the platelets that contains which mainly functions for blood clotting, and the blood plasma that comprises 90% of water, and of course other dissolved proteins and substances. So with that, we will come to the end of this part one. What you can do is you can watch the next video to learn more about blood groups and functions of blood, and do remember to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next section. Thank you, and have a